Marcus Williams pressed his face against the cold glass window of the downtown diner, watching the steam rise from hot plates being served inside. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. The 15-year-old boy clutched the crumpled $10 bill in his pocket, his last bit of money until his mother got paid from her cleaning job next week. The autumn wind cut through his thin jacket as he pushed open the diner's heavy door. The warmth inside felt like a gentle hug, and the smell of freshly cooked food made his mouth water. Marcus had been walking around the city for hours, looking for odd jobs to earn a few extra dollars. His mother, Sarah, worked 3 jobs just to keep their small apartment, but it was never quite enough. She had left early that morning for her weekend shift at the hospital, leaving Marcus with strict instructions to use the money only for food. He slid into a worn booth near the back, trying to make himself invisible. The diner was busy with the lunch crowd, filled with families enjoying their weekend meals together. Marcus studied the menu carefully, calculating every cent. A simple burger and fries would cost $8, leaving him with $2 for tomorrow. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he waited for the waitress to take his order, Marcus noticed an elderly couple at a table near the front. The man wore a faded military jacket with patches that suggested he was a veteran, while the woman beside him clutched a worn purse tightly in her lap. They were speaking in hushed tones, and Marcus couldn't help but overhear their conversation. "Harold, we can't afford anything more than coffee," the woman whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "Maybe we should just leave." The man, Harold, reached across the table and took her hand. "Now, Eleanor, we've been walking for 3 hours. You need to eat something. Your diabetes medicine won't work right on an empty stomach." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the menu. "But we only have $6 left, and that needs to last us until your disability check comes in on Tuesday. That's 4 more days, Harold." Marcus watched as Harold's shoulders sagged with the weight of their situation. The old man's hands shook slightly as he counted the crumpled bills in his wallet. Marcus recognized that look of desperation, the same expression his mother wore when she thought he wasn't watching her struggle to pay bills. The waitress, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, approached their table with a gentle smile. "What can I get you folks today?" Harold cleared his throat and tried to sound confident. "Just 2 coffees, please, and maybe some crackers if you have them." The waitress noticed Eleanor's pale complexion and the way she swayed slightly in her seat. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right? You look a little weak." Eleanor forced a smile. "I'm fine, dear. Just a little tired from our walk." But Marcus could see she wasn't fine. He had watched his own grandmother struggle with diabetes before she passed away 2 years ago. He recognized the signs of low blood sugar and knew Eleanor needed food soon. Without thinking, Marcus stood up and walked over to their table. Harold and Eleanor looked up at him with surprise, not expecting a young stranger to approach them. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, his heart pounding. "I couldn't help but overhear. I was wondering if you folks would like to join me for lunch. I hate eating alone, and it would mean a lot to have some company." Harold's pride immediately kicked in. "That's very kind of you, son, but we couldn't impose. We're fine with just coffee." Marcus smiled warmly, the same smile his mother used when she wanted to help someone without making them feel embarrassed. "Please, I insist. My grandmother always told me that food tastes better when it's shared. Besides, I already ordered way too much food for just me." It was a lie, of course. Marcus hadn't ordered anything yet, and the $10 in his pocket was all he had. But something deep inside him, perhaps the lessons his mother had taught him about kindness and community, compelled him to help this couple. Eleanor looked at Harold with hopeful eyes. She was clearly struggling, and the thought of a real meal was almost too tempting to refuse. "Are you sure, young man?" Harold asked, studying Marcus's face. "We don't want to be any trouble." "No trouble at all," Marcus replied, signaling to the waitress. "Actually, you'd be doing me a favor. I'm new in town and don't know many people yet." Another lie, but one that seemed to ease Harold's discomfort about accepting help from a stranger, especially someone so young. The waitress approached with her notepad ready. Marcus looked at the menu one more time, making quick calculations in his head. If he ordered carefully, he could get Harold and Eleanor a decent meal with his $10, but there wouldn't be anything left for himself. We'll have 2 of the daily specials, Marcus said confidently. The meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans. And could you bring some extra bread, please? What about for you, honey? The waitress asked Marcus. Marcus's stomach growled again, but he smiled and shook his head. I'm not very hungry right now. Maybe just some water. Eleanor frowned with concern. Nonsense, young man. If you're buying us lunch, at least let us share it with you. But Marcus had already made up his mind. He watched as color slowly returned to Eleanor's cheeks at the thought of a proper meal, and he knew he had made the right choice. Sometimes, he thought, helping others was more important than helping yourself. As they waited for the food to arrive, Marcus learned that Harold and Eleanor had been married for 43 years. Harold had served in Vietnam and now lived on a small disability pension. Eleanor had worked as a schoolteacher until her health began to fail. They had fallen behind on their rent and were facing eviction, spending their days walking around the city while trying to figure out their next move. When the plates arrived, steaming and generous, Marcus felt a warm satisfaction watching the elderly couple eat with obvious relief and gratitude. He sipped his water and listened to their stories, feeling richer than any money could make him. After Harold and Eleanor finished their meal, Marcus paid the bill with his $10 bill, leaving him with exactly nothing. The waitress, whose name tag read Betty, looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern as she processed the payment. That was a beautiful thing you did, young man, she whispered as she handed him his receipt. Not many people your age would give up their last meal for strangers. Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. My mom always says we're all just walking each other home in this life. As they prepared to leave the diner, Eleanor stood up slowly, her movements much steadier now that she had eaten. She took Marcus's hand in both of hers, her eyes bright with unshed tears. What's your name, dear? She asked softly. Marcus Williams, ma'am. Marcus, she repeated, as if committing it to memory. You have given us more than food today. You've given us hope when we had almost given up. Harold extended his weathered hand to Marcus, gripping it firmly. Son, I've met a lot of people in my 72 years on this earth, but I've rarely encountered such kindness from someone so young. Your parents raised you right. Marcus felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment. It wasn't anything special. Anyone would have done the same. No, Harold said firmly, his eyes serious. Most people would have minded their own business. You chose to see us, really see us, when most of the world looks right through people like Eleanor and me. As they stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, Marcus realized he had no idea where Harold and Eleanor were going to spend the night. The thought troubled him deeply. Do you folks have somewhere safe to stay tonight? He asked gently. Harold and Eleanor exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Finally, Harold answered, We've been staying at the Salvation Army shelter when there's space. If not, there's a warm spot under the bridge near 5th Street. The idea of this sweet elderly couple sleeping under a bridge made Marcus's heart ache. He thought about his own small apartment, barely big enough for him and his mother, but at least it was warm and safe. Listen, Marcus said, pulling out his phone. Let me call my mom. We don't have much space, but we have a couch and it's warm. She won't mind, I promise, but Harold held up his hand. Marcus, you've already done too much. We can't impose on your family like that. You're not imposing, Marcus insisted. My mom would be upset with me if I let you sleep outside when we have a roof over our heads. Eleanor touched Harold's arm gently. Harold, the boy is offering from his heart. Maybe we should accept. After some gentle persuasion, Harold finally agreed to let Marcus call his mother. Sarah Williams answered on the 3rd ring, and Marcus could hear the exhaustion in her voice from her long day at work. Marcus, is everything okay? You sound different. Mom, I'm fine, but I met this elderly couple today, and they need a place to stay tonight. Could they possibly use our couch? I know it's small, but bring them home, Sarah interrupted without hesitation. We'll figure it out. Are they safe? Are you safe? Yes, Mom, they're good people. Just down on their luck, then bring them home. I'll stop by the store on my way back from work. When Marcus hung up, he saw Eleanor wiping tears from her eyes. Your mother sounds like an angel, she said. The 3 of them walked slowly through the city streets toward Marcus's neighborhood. Harold moved carefully, favoring his right leg where shrapnel from the war still caused him pain. Eleanor stayed close to his side, occasionally pausing to catch her breath. As they walked, Marcus learned more about their story. Harold had worked construction for 30 years after returning from Vietnam, but a fall from scaffolding had damaged his back and ended his career early. Eleanor had taught third grade for 25 years, touching the lives of hundreds of children, but her pension was barely enough to cover her medical expenses. We had a little house, Eleanor explained as they paused at a crosswalk. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. When Harold got sick last year and couldn't work anymore, we fell behind on the mortgage. The bank was patient for a while, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus understood the cruel mathematics of poverty all too well. We've been trying to find Harold work, something he can do with his back problems, Eleanor continued. But most employers see a 72-year-old man with health issues and move on to the next application. Have you tried applying for housing assistance? Marcus asked. Harold nodded grimly. We're on a waiting list. Number 847, they told us it could be 2 years before something opens up. 2 years. Marcus couldn't imagine what 2 years of uncertainty and instability would do to people their age. As they entered Marcus's neighborhood, he felt a sudden wave of self-consciousness. The buildings were older, some with broken windows patched with cardboard. Graffiti covered many of the walls and litter scattered the sidewalks. It wasn't the worst neighborhood in the city, but it certainly wasn't the best. I should warn you, Marcus said quietly. Our place isn't much. It's pretty small and the building is kind of old. Eleanor smiled warmly. Honey, after 3 weeks of sleeping in shelters and under bridges, anywhere with a roof and 4 walls sounds like a palace. They climbed 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B. Marcus fumbled with his keys, suddenly nervous about bringing strangers into their home. But when he opened the door, he was greeted by the warm smell of his mother's cooking. Sarah Williams emerged from the tiny kitchen, flour dusting her dark hands. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled the room with warmth and strength. Her eyes immediately went to Harold and Eleanor, taking in their worn clothes and tired faces with the quick assessment of someone who had known hardship herself. Welcome to our home, she said simply, moving forward to embrace Eleanor as if she were an old friend. I'm Sarah. I hope you're hungry because I made way too much food. Marcus watched his mother work her magic, making Harold and Eleanor feel welcomed and valued rather than like charity cases. She had stopped at the store on her way home and somehow stretched their grocery budget to include ingredients for a feast. The smell of fried chicken, cornbread, and green beans filled the small apartment. As they sat around the tiny kitchen table that barely fit 4 people, Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude. Here was his mother, tired from working all day, sharing what little they had with complete strangers because it was the right thing to do. Marcus told me about what happened at the diner today, Sarah said as she served generous portions to everyone. I'm proud of him, but I can't say I'm surprised. His grandmother always said he had an old soul. Harold raised his glass of sweet tea to Marcus and Sarah Williams for reminding us that there are still good people in this world. As they shared the meal together, Marcus realized that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could create the biggest changes. He had no idea that this simple decision to share his last $10 would set in motion events that would change all of their lives forever. That evening, as Harold and Eleanor settled onto the pull-out couch that Sarah had quickly made up with her best sheets, an unusual conversation began to unfold. Marcus was doing his homework at the kitchen table, while his mother finished cleaning the dishes, when Harold's voice carried across the small apartment. Eleanor, look at this, Harold said, his voice filled with wonder as he examined a framed photograph on the side table. Sarah, is this your father? Sarah dried her hands and walked over to where Harold was sitting. The photograph showed a young black man in military uniform, his smile bright against the sepia tones of the old picture. Yes, that's my daddy, Sarah said softly. James Washington. He served in Vietnam, died in 1969 when I was just 8 years old. Harold's hands began to tremble as he held the photograph closer to the lamplight. His eyes widened with recognition and Eleanor could see the color drain from his face. Sarah, Harold whispered, his voice barely audible. What was your father's rank and unit? Something in Harold's tone made both Marcus and Sarah stop what they were doing and pay close attention. He was a staff sergeant with the 1st Infantry Division, stationed near Cu Chi, Sarah replied, moving closer. Why do you ask? Harold set the photograph down carefully and looked up at Sarah with tears in his eyes. I think your father saved my life. The silence in the small apartment was deafening. Marcus closed his textbook and joined the group around the couch, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. November 15th, 1969. Harold continued, his voice growing stronger with memory. We were on patrol near Kuchi when we walked into an ambush. I was just a private, 19 years old and scared out of my mind. A grenade landed right next to me and I froze. Couldn't move, couldn't think. This sergeant came out of nowhere, tackled me and threw himself on top of that grenade. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as Harold continued. The explosion threw us both about 10 feet. The sergeant took most of the shrapnel in his back and chest. He died in my arms while we waited for the medic helicopter, but not before he told me his name and made me promise something. What did he promise? Eleanor asked softly, reaching for Harold's shaking hand. He made me promise that if I ever made it home I would live a good life, that I would help people whenever I could because that's what would make his sacrifice mean something. Harold looked directly at Sarah. His name was James Washington. He told me he had a little girl back home in Chicago named Sarah, and that everything he did was for her. Sarah sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by this impossible coincidence. Marcus felt his own eyes filling with tears as he watched his mother process this revelation. Your father was the bravest man I ever met, Harold continued. I've carried his memory with me every single day for over 50 years. I named my son James in his honor. Sarah wiped her tears with the back of her hand. You have a son named James? Eleanor nodded, her own eyes wet with emotion. James Harold Patterson. He's a doctor now, living in Seattle. Harold always told him the story of the sergeant who saved his life, and how that man's courage inspired Harold to spend his life helping others. Is that why you became a teacher? Marcus asked Eleanor, beginning to understand the deeper connections at play. Partly, yes, Eleanor replied. Harold told me James Washington's story on our second date. I knew then that I was in love with a man who understood what real heroism looked like. It inspired me to want to help children, to make a difference in young lives the way your father made a difference in Harold's. Sarah stood up slowly and walked to a small box she kept on the bookshelf. From it, she pulled out a faded letter, its edges worn from years of handling. This is the last letter my daddy wrote to me, she said, sitting back down next to Harold.
He mailed it 3 days before he died.
Would you like me to read it? Harold nodded, unable to speak. Sarah unfolded the letter carefully and began to read in a voice thick with emotion. My dearest Sarah, I hope this letter finds you being good for your mama and doing well in school. Daddy is thinking about you every single day over here. I want you to know that everything I do here, I do because I love you and want to make the world a safer place for little girls like you. If something happens to me, I need you to remember that helping others is the most important thing we can do in this life. Be kind to people, especially those who have less than you. Look out for the elderly and the lonely. Take care of your mama, and when you grow up, raise your children to be good people who help others. That's how we make the world better, one person at a time. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Love, Daddy. By the time Sarah finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Harold reached out and took Sarah's hand in both of his. Your father was right, Harold said through his tears. You and Marcus are living proof of his wisdom. The kindness you showed Eleanor and me today, the way you opened your home to strangers, that's your father's legacy living on. Marcus felt a profound sense of connection to these people who had been strangers just hours ago. The idea that his grandfather's sacrifice had saved the life of this man, who had then dedicated his life to helping others, which led to Eleanor becoming a teacher who influenced hundreds of children, created a beautiful circle of kindness that had somehow brought them all together. There's something else, Harold said, reaching into his wallet. He pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. I've carried this with me for 54 years. It's the address your father gave me in case I ever wanted to find his family after the war. He handed the paper to Sarah. Written in faded pencil was an address on the south side of Chicago, just 3 blocks from where Sarah had grown up. I tried to find you once, Harold admitted, about 10 years after the war. But the building had been torn down, and nobody in the neighborhood knew where the Washington family had moved. Sarah smiled through her tears. We moved to my aunt's house after Daddy died. Mama couldn't afford the rent on her own. Eleanor squeezed Harold's other hand. Harold has wondered about James Washington's family his entire life. He always regretted not being able to tell his daughter how brave her father was, how his sacrifice saved not just Harold's life, but all the lives Harold was able to touch because he survived. Marcus looked around at the three adults, all connected by threads of history and kindness that stretched across decades. He thought about the simple decision he had made that afternoon to share his meal with two strangers, never imagining it would lead to this moment of profound connection. "Maybe this is why I felt like I had to help you today," Marcus said quietly. "Maybe Grandpa's spirit was watching over all of us." Harold nodded firmly. "I believe that, son. I truly do. Your grandfather saved my life so that I could live to meet his grandson and granddaughter-in-law 54 years later. So that we could all be here together right now, taking care of each other." As the evening grew late, the four of them sat together in the warm glow of the living room lamp, sharing stories and marveling at the incredible coincidence that had brought them together. None of them could have imagined that a simple act of kindness would reveal such deep connections between their families. Connections that stretched across time and tragedy to create something beautiful and healing. Outside, the city continued its restless pace, but inside apartment 3B, four people who had been strangers that morning had become something much more precious. They had become family. What none of them knew was that their encounter at the diner had been witnessed by someone whose life would soon intersect with theirs in the most unexpected way. Richard Caldwell sat in his black Mercedes across the street from the diner, waiting for his business associate to arrive for their lunch meeting. At 68 years old, Richard was one of the wealthiest men in the city, having built a fortune through real estate development and shrewd investments. His company, Caldwell Enterprises, owned dozens of buildings throughout the metropolitan area, including several low-income housing developments. Richard had grown up poor in Detroit, the son of a factory worker who died young, leaving his mother to raise 5 children alone. He had clawed his way out of poverty through determination, intelligence, and admittedly some ruthless business practices that he wasn't particularly proud of. Success had brought him money and power, but it had also hardened him. He rarely thought about the human cost of his business decisions anymore. That afternoon, as he checked his watch impatiently and wondered where his associate was, Richard's attention was caught by the scene unfolding in the diner window. He watched a young black teenager approach an elderly couple and strike up a conversation. At first, Richard assumed the boy was bothering them, perhaps panhandling or causing trouble. His initial instinct was to call the police, but something made him continue watching instead. Through the large windows of the diner, Richard could see the body language of all three people clearly. The elderly couple wasn't afraid or annoyed. They were grateful. The boy wasn't aggressive or demanding. He was gentle and respectful. When the waitress came to take their order, Richard watched in amazement as the teenager ordered food for the elderly couple, but nothing for himself. Richard's cynical mind immediately began calculating. The kid was probably running some kind of scam, he thought. Maybe he was hoping to impress the old couple so they would give him money later. People always had angles, especially poor people trying to work the system. But as the meal progressed, Richard's assumptions began to crumble. The boy never asked for anything. He didn't seem to be working any angle at all. He simply sat there sipping water and listening attentively as the elderly couple ate and talked. When it came time to pay, Richard watched the teenager hand over what appeared to be his last bills to cover the entire meal. This puzzled Richard deeply. In his experience, people didn't give away their last money to strangers without expecting something in return. There had to be a catch, some hidden motive he wasn't seeing. His business associate finally arrived, apologizing for being late due to traffic. But Richard found himself distracted throughout their lunch meeting, his eyes repeatedly drifting to the window where he had witnessed the scene earlier. Even after the three people had left the diner together, Richard couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. "Richard, are you listening?" his associate asked, noticing his distraction. "Sorry, what were you saying about the Patterson property acquisition?" The associate, a sharp-faced man named Collins, pulled out a folder of documents. "The elderly couple living in Building 412 on Maple Street. Harold and Eleanor Patterson. They're behind on rent and facing eviction. We can probably get them out by the end of the month and renovate the unit for market rate." Richard's attention snapped back to the conversation. "Patterson? What do they look like?" Collins seemed surprised by the question. "I don't know. Old, I guess." "Why does it matter?" But Richard's mind was racing. Patterson was an uncommon name, and the timing was too coincidental. Could the elderly couple he had just witnessed be the same people Collins was talking about evicting? "Show me their file," Richard demanded. Collins handed over a thin folder containing an application form with a small attached photograph. Richard's breath caught in his throat. It was them, the same couple he had just watched being helped by the young teenager. Harold and Eleanor Patterson, ages 72 and 69, living in one of his buildings. "How much do they owe?" Richard asked quietly. "About $4,000 in back rent. They've been sending partial payments when they can, but it's not enough. Honestly, we could have evicted them months ago, but the property manager felt sorry for them." Richard studied the photograph more closely. Harold was wearing the same faded military jacket he had worn in the diner. Eleanor had the same gentle face and worried eyes. According to their file, Harold was a disabled veteran receiving a small pension, and Eleanor was a retired teacher with mounting medical bills. "What's the building worth with all units at market rate?" Richard asked. Collins consulted his notes. "We could probably get another $800 per month for their unit once it's renovated. That's almost $10,000 annually in additional revenue." Richard nodded slowly, his business mind automatically calculating profits and returns. From a purely financial standpoint, evicting the Pattersons made perfect sense. They were a liability, a drain on the property's earning potential. Any competent businessman would have them out immediately. But Richard couldn't get the image out of his head of the young man giving his last $10 to help these people. There was something about that act of selfless kindness that had shaken something loose inside him, something he thought he had buried years ago under layers of cynicism and greed. "Sir?" Collins prompted. "Should I proceed with the eviction paperwork?" Richard closed the file and handed it back to Collins. "Not yet. I want to think about this." Collins looked confused. "Think about what?" "They're behind on rent. We evict them, renovate, and increase revenue. It's straightforward." "Nothing in life is that straightforward," Richard replied, surprising himself with the words. After Collins left, Richard sat alone in his office on the 42nd floor of the Caldwell Tower, staring out at the city below. He thought about his own childhood, living in a cramped apartment with his mother and siblings, never knowing if they would have enough money for rent or food. He remembered the fear in his mother's eyes every month when the bills came due, and the shame he felt wearing second-hand clothes to school. When had he become the kind of man who profited from other people's desperation? When had he stopped seeing tenants as human beings and started seeing them only as sources of revenue? Richard opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph of his mother, taken just before she died. She had been proud of his success, but he wondered what she would think of some of the methods he had used to achieve it. Would she be proud of the man he had become? Or would she be disappointed by the person he had lost along the way? The teenager's act of kindness kept replaying in Richard's mind. That boy had given away his last money to help strangers, expecting nothing in return. When was the last time Richard had done something purely good, without calculating the potential benefit to himself? He picked up his phone and dialed his property manager for the Maple Street building. "Henderson, it's Richard Caldwell. I want you to pull the file on Harold and Eleanor Patterson in Unit 412. "Yes, sir. Are you calling about the eviction? I can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow." "No," Richard said firmly. "I'm calling to discuss other options. I'll be visiting the property personally tomorrow morning." Henderson sounded surprised. Richard Caldwell never visited his low-income properties personally. That was what property managers were for. "Sir, is there a problem with the building?" "No problem," Richard replied. "I just want to see something for myself." As he hung up the phone, Richard realized he was nervous about the visit. It had been years since he had actually walked through one of his rental properties. Years since he had seen firsthand the conditions his tenants lived in. He had insulated himself from that reality with property managers and financial reports, preferring to think about his tenants as numbers on a spreadsheet rather than as real people with real struggles. But something about witnessing that young man's kindness had cracked open a door in Richard's heart that he had sealed shut long ago. Tomorrow he would walk through that door and see what he found on the other side. That night Richard barely slept. He kept thinking about the teenager's face as he ordered food for the elderly couple, the gentle way he had treated them, the quiet dignity with which he had given away everything he had. There was something pure about that act of kindness that made Richard feel both inspired and ashamed. He had spent decades accumulating wealth and power, But when was the last time he had felt the simple satisfaction that he saw on that young man's face? When was the last time he had done something that mattered? Something that made the world a little bit better instead of just making himself a little bit richer? As dawn broke over the city, Richard made a decision that would change not only his own life, but the lives of Harold, Eleanor, Marcus, and Sarah, in ways none of them could possibly imagine. The next morning, Richard Caldwell drove through neighborhoods he owned but had never really seen. The buildings that generated millions in rental income for him were more rundown than he had imagined. Broken windows were patched with cardboard, graffiti covered brick walls, and trash littered the sidewalks. These weren't just investment properties to him anymore. They were homes where real people lived, struggled, and tried to build decent lives despite the challenges around them. Building 412 on Maple Street was a 4-story brick structure built in the 1940s. Like most of Richard's low-income properties, it showed its age. The front steps were cracked, the paint was peeling, and several windows had been boarded up. Richard felt a wave of shame as he realized he had been collecting rent from this building for 15 years, without ever seeing its actual condition. Henderson, the property manager, met him at the front entrance. He was a thin, nervous man in his 50s who seemed genuinely surprised by Richard's unexpected visit. "Mr. Caldwell, I have to say, this is quite unusual. You've never asked to tour one of the buildings before." "Maybe that's been a mistake," Richard replied, studying the deteriorating facade. "Tell me about the Patterson couple." Henderson pulled out a clipboard with notes. "Harold and Eleanor Patterson, apartment 3A. They've been here 8 years. Generally quiet. No complaints from other tenants. The problem is they lost their primary income source about 6 months ago, when Mr. Patterson became too disabled to work his part-time security job." Richard nodded. "What about their rent history before that?" "Actually, they were model tenants. Always paid on time, sometimes even early. Mrs. Patterson used to bake cookies for the other residents during holidays. But when his health declined and they lost that income, they started falling behind. As they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, Richard noticed that the hallways were cleaner than he had expected. Someone had made an effort to maintain dignity in this aging building despite its problems. "The Pattersons do a lot of the maintenance around here voluntarily," Henderson explained, noticing Richard's observation. "Mr. Patterson fixes leaky faucets and Mrs. Patterson organizes cleaning days with the other residents. They really care about this place." They stopped outside apartment 3A. Richard could hear voices inside but couldn't make out the words. For a moment he hesitated. These people had no idea who he was or that their landlord was standing outside their door deciding their fate. "Should I knock?" Henderson asked. Before Richard could answer, the door opened and Eleanor Patterson stepped out carrying a bag of trash. She was startled to see 2 men in suits standing in her hallway. "Oh, excuse me," she said politely. "I was just taking this to the dumpster." Richard found himself face to face with the woman he had watched being helped by the young stranger the day before. Up close he could see the worry lines around her eyes, but also the inherent kindness in her expression. "Mrs. Patterson?" Henderson said formally. "This is Mr. Caldwell. He owns the building and wanted to meet some of the residents." Eleanor's face went pale. In her experience, when landlords showed up personally, it usually meant bad news. "Is everything all right? Are we in trouble?" "No trouble," Richard said quickly, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "I was just in the neighborhood and wanted to see how everyone was doing." From inside the apartment, Harold's voice called out, "Eleanor, is everything okay out there?" "It's fine, Harold," she called back. Then to Richard's surprise, she invited them in. "Would you gentlemen like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." Richard followed Eleanor into the small apartment, immediately struck by how clean and well-maintained it was despite its obvious age. The furniture was old but carefully preserved, and everything had its place. Family photographs covered one wall, showing decades of memories and milestones. Harold appeared from the bedroom, moving slowly with the aid of a walker. He wore the same military jacket Richard had seen him in at the diner, and his eyes held the alert intelligence of someone who had faced real adversity and survived. "Harold Patterson," he said, extending his hand to Richard. "Welcome to our home." Richard shook the older man's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "Richard Caldwell, pleased to meet you." As Eleanor bustled around the tiny kitchen preparing coffee, Richard noticed details that his property reports had never captured. Medical bills were neatly stacked on the kitchen table next to a carefully maintained household budget, written in Eleanor's precise teacher handwriting. A collection of well-worn books filled a small bookshelf, and children's drawings were taped to the refrigerator. "Are those from your grandchildren?" Richard asked, nodding toward the drawings. Eleanor's face lit up. "Oh no, we never had children of our own. Those are from the kids in the building. I help them with their homework sometimes, and they like to bring me their artwork." Harold settled carefully into a worn armchair. "Eleanor retired from teaching, but she can't seem to stop being a teacher. Half the kids in this building improve their grades once she starts helping them." Richard felt another stab of shame. Here were people who were struggling to pay their own rent, yet they were still finding ways to help others and contribute to their community. "Mr. Caldwell," Harold said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you here about our rent situation? We know we're behind and we're doing everything we can to catch up." Richard looked around the apartment again, taking in the carefully patched furniture and the obvious pride these people took in their home despite their financial struggles. "Actually," Richard said slowly, "I wanted to ask you about something else. Yesterday, were you and Mrs. Patterson at Tony's Diner downtown?" Harold and Eleanor exchanged surprised glances. "Yes, we were," Eleanor said carefully. "How did you know that?" "I happened to see you there with a young man. A teenager who bought you lunch." Eleanor's face broke into a radiant smile. "Marcus, oh, what a wonderful boy. We spent the night at his apartment with him and his mother. Such kind people. You stayed with them?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. "Harold and I have been having some difficulties," Eleanor explained diplomatically. "Marcus and his mother Sarah opened their home to us even though they barely have enough space for themselves." Harold leaned forward in his chair. "Mr. Caldwell, I've lived a long time and met a lot of people, but I've rarely encountered the kind of pure kindness that boy showed us. He gave us his last money for food, and then his family welcomed us like we were relatives." Richard felt something shift inside his chest, a warming sensation he hadn't experienced in years. "Tell me more about Marcus." For the next hour, Harold and Eleanor shared the story of their encounter with Marcus and Sarah, including the incredible revelation about Sarah's father and Harold's military service. As they talked, Richard found himself more and more amazed by the young man whose simple act of kindness had led to such an extraordinary connection. "The boy gave away everything he had to help us," Harold concluded. "And when we told his mother the story about her father, it was like watching a miracle unfold. Sarah's father saved my life in Vietnam, and 54 years later her son saved our lives in that diner." Eleanor wiped her eyes with a tissue. "They wouldn't let us leave this morning without taking some of Sarah's homemade biscuits for breakfast. That woman works 3 jobs but still found time to cook for us." Richard sat quietly, absorbing everything he had heard. The young man who had impressed him so much at the diner was even more remarkable than he had realized. And these elderly people, who were facing eviction from his building, were clearly decent, caring individuals who had fallen on hard times through no fault of their own. "Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor said hesitantly, "Harold and I want to be honest with you about our situation. We're behind on rent and we know that's not fair to you. If you need us to leave, we understand. But we're hoping we might be able to work out some kind of payment plan." Richard looked at these two people who were facing homelessness, but still maintained their dignity and their concern for others. He thought about Marcus giving away his last $10, and Sarah working 3 jobs while still opening her home to strangers. He thought about his own mother and what she would want him to do in this situation. "Mrs. Patterson," Richard said finally, "I don't think a payment plan will be necessary." Henderson looked confused, but Richard continued. "I've been thinking about this building and I believe some changes need to be made, starting with the rent structure." Harold and Eleanor waited anxiously for him to continue, unsure what this might mean for their future. Richard stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood below. "I think," he said slowly, "it's time I started running my business differently." What he said next would surprise everyone in the room, including himself. The next morning, Marcus was getting ready for school when he heard a firm knock at the apartment door. It was barely 7 in the morning, and unexpected visitors at that hour usually meant trouble. Sarah was already at her early shift at the hospital, and Harold and Eleanor had left an hour earlier to check on their remaining belongings at the shelter. Marcus opened the door to find a well-dressed older man in an expensive suit standing in the hallway. The man was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed oddly familiar, though Marcus was certain they had never met. "Are you Marcus Williams?" the man asked with a warm smile. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied cautiously, not opening the door all the way. His mother had taught him to be careful with strangers, especially ones who showed up unannounced. "My name is Richard Caldwell. I wonder if we could talk for a few minutes. It's about Harold and Eleanor Patterson." Marcus's protective instincts immediately kicked in. "Are they in trouble? Did something happen to them?" "Nothing bad," Richard assured him quickly. "Quite the opposite, actually. May I come in? I have something important to discuss with you." Reluctantly, Marcus let Richard into the small apartment. The older man looked around with obvious interest, taking in the tidy but modest furnishings, the photographs of Marcus's father and grandfather, and the homework still spread across the kitchen table. "You have a lovely home," Richard said sincerely. "Harold and Eleanor told me how welcoming you and your mother were to them." "They told you about that?" Marcus asked, puzzled. "How do you know them?" Richard smiled. "It's a bit of a long story. Marcus, what I'm about to tell you might sound unbelievable, but I want you to know that every word is true. Yesterday afternoon I happened to witness what you did at Tony's diner." Marcus felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. "You saw that?" "I did. I was sitting in my car across the street waiting for a business meeting. I watched you approach Harold and Eleanor, and I watched you buy them lunch with what appeared to be your last money." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't that big a deal. Anyone would have done the same thing." Richard shook his head. "No, Marcus. Most people wouldn't have done what you did. In fact, I'm ashamed to say that my first instinct was to assume you were running some kind of scam." "A scam?" Marcus looked confused. "I've spent so many years in business, surrounded by people who always have an angle, that I couldn't believe someone would give away their last money to strangers without expecting something in return. But as I watched you, I realized I was witnessing something I hadn't seen in a very long time. Pure, selfless kindness." Richard paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Marcus, I need to tell you something else. I own the building where Harold and Eleanor live. They were facing eviction because they're behind on their rent." Marcus's eyes widened with alarm. "Were? What do you mean, were?" "Yesterday, after witnessing your kindness, I went to visit them. I wanted to understand what kind of people you had helped. What I found were two of the most decent, caring individuals I've ever met. People who, despite facing homelessness themselves, still volunteer to help their neighbors and tutor children in their building." Richard walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. "Your act of kindness made me realize something, Marcus. I've spent the last 30 years building a real estate empire, accumulating wealth and power. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what really matters. I forgot that behind every rent payment is a human being with hopes, dreams, and struggles." He turned back to Marcus. "I've decided to forgive Harold and Eleanor's debt entirely. They won't be evicted. In fact, I'm implementing a new policy across all my buildings. No one will be evicted simply because they fall behind on rent, due to medical emergencies or job loss. We'll work with people to find solutions." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. "That's amazing, Mr. Caldwell. Harold and Eleanor are going to be so happy." "There's more," Richard continued. "I spent yesterday evening thinking about your sacrifice, and I realized that one good deed deserves to inspire another. I want to do something for you and your mother." Marcus became wary again. "We don't need charity, sir. My mom works hard for everything we have." Richard smiled at the boy's pride. "This isn't charity, Marcus. This is an investment. I've been successful in business partly because I can recognize potential when I see it. And you, young man, have extraordinary potential." Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "I've done some research on you, Marcus. Your grades are excellent despite the fact that you work part-time jobs to help your mother with expenses. Your teachers describe you as mature, responsible, and kind. You dream of going to college but worry about the cost." Marcus nodded slowly, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I want to establish a college scholarship fund for you," Richard said, handing Marcus the envelope. "Full tuition, room and board, and living expenses for any 4-year university you choose to attend." Marcus stared at the envelope in shock. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" "Because yesterday a 15-year-old boy taught a 68-year-old businessman what real wealth looks like. True wealth isn't in bank accounts or property portfolios. It's in the ability to help others, to make the world a little bit better than you found it. Richard sat down across from Marcus. Your grandfather died fighting for freedom and justice. Your mother works 3 jobs to provide for you. And you gave away your last $10 to help 2 strangers. That kind of character, that kind of heart is exactly what this world needs more of. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. Mr. Caldwell, this is too much. I can't accept this. You can and you will, Richard said firmly but kindly. But there are conditions. I want you to promise me that you'll use your education to help others. Whether you become a doctor, teacher, lawyer, or business person, I want you to remember that success means nothing if you don't use it to lift others up. Marcus thought about his grandfather's letter, about his mother's sacrifices, about Harold and Eleanor's story. I promise, he said solemnly. Richard smiled. There's one more thing. I want to offer your mother a job. I need someone to oversee community relations for my properties. Someone who understands what it's like to struggle and can help create programs to support tenants facing difficulties. The salary will be enough for her to quit her other jobs and focus on just one meaningful career. Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. She would love that. Mom has always wanted to help people professionally, but she never had the opportunity. The opportunity is here now, Richard said. And Marcus, this is just the beginning. I plan to establish a foundation dedicated to recognizing and rewarding acts of kindness like yours. Young people who demonstrate exceptional character will receive scholarships and mentorship opportunities. Marcus looked down at the envelope in his hands, still struggling to process how dramatically his life had just changed. I have to ask you something, Mr. Caldwell. Why didn't you just mail this or call? Why did you come here personally? Richard thought for a moment. Because 30 years ago I was a lot like you. I grew up poor, worked hard, and had big dreams. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why I was working so hard. I became focused on accumulating wealth instead of using it wisely. Your simple act of kindness reminded me who I used to be and who I want to be again. He stood up and extended his hand to Marcus. I came here personally because I wanted to thank you. You gave away $10 and changed 4 lives forever. You helped Harold and Eleanor. You gave your mother hope for the future. And you reminded an old businessman what really matters in life. As they shook hands, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just a gift. It was a calling. He thought about all the people he could help with a good education, all the kindness he could pay forward. Mr. Caldwell, Marcus said, I won't let you down. I know you won't, Richard replied. And Marcus, keep giving away those $10. The world needs more people like you. After Richard left, Marcus sat alone in the quiet apartment, holding the envelope that contained his future. He thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. His decision to help 2 strangers, the incredible revelation about his grandfather's sacrifice, and now this life-changing opportunity. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. Working late again tonight. There's leftover soup in the fridge. Love you. Marcus smiled, knowing that by tonight he would have the most amazing news to share with her. He thought about Harold and Eleanor, who would no longer face eviction, and about all the other tenants in Richard's buildings who would benefit from his newfound commitment to compassionate business practices. Sometimes, Marcus realized, the smallest acts of kindness create ripples that spread far beyond what we can imagine. His $10 gesture had not only changed his own life, but had inspired a wealthy businessman to transform his entire approach to helping others. As he got ready for school, Marcus made a mental note to stop by Tony's diner after classes. He wanted to thank Betty, the waitress, for her kindness that day, and maybe, if he was lucky, he would have the chance to help another stranger in need. After all, he had learned that true wealth wasn't about what you kept for yourself, but about what you gave away to others. And in that R? Marcus asked, puzzled. How do you know them? Richard smiled. It's a bit of a long story. Marcus, what I'm about to tell you might sound unbelievable, but I want you to know that every word is true. Yesterday afternoon I happened to witness what you did at Tony's diner. Marcus felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. You saw that? I did. I was sitting in my car across the street waiting for a business meeting. I watched you approach Harold and Eleanor, and I watched you buy them lunch with what appeared to be your last money. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't that big a deal. Anyone would have done the same thing. Richard shook his head. No, Marcus. Most people wouldn't have done what you did. In fact, I'm ashamed to say that my first instinct was to assume you were running some kind of scam. A scam? Marcus looked confused. I've spent so many years in business, surrounded by people who always have an angle, that I couldn't believe someone would give away their last money to strangers without expecting something in return. But as I watched you, I realized I was witnessing something I hadn't seen in a very long time. Pure, selfless kindness. Richard paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Marcus, I need to tell you something else. I own the building where Harold and Eleanor live. They were facing eviction because they're behind on their rent. Marcus's eyes widened with alarm. What do you mean, were? Yesterday, after witnessing your kindness, I went to visit them. I wanted to understand what kind of people you had helped. What I found were two of the most decent, caring individuals I've ever met. People who, despite facing homelessness themselves, still volunteer to help their neighbors and tutor children in their building. Richard walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. Your act of kindness made me realize something, Marcus. I've spent the last 30 years building a real estate empire, accumulating wealth and power. But somewhere along the way I forgot what really matters. I forgot that behind every rent payment is a human being with hopes, dreams, and struggles. He turned back to Marcus. I've decided to forgive Harold and Eleanor's debt entirely. They won't be evicted. In fact, I'm implementing a new policy across all my buildings. No one will be evicted simply because they fall behind on rent due to medical emergencies or job loss. We'll work with people to find solutions. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. That's amazing, Mr. Caldwell. Harold and Eleanor are going to be so happy. There's more, Richard continued. I spent yesterday evening thinking about your sacrifice, and I realized that one good deed deserves to inspire another. I want to do something for you and your mother. Marcus became wary again. We don't need charity, sir. My mom works hard for everything we have. Richard smiled at the boy's pride. This isn't charity, Marcus. This is an investment. I've been successful in business partly because I can recognize potential when I see it. And you, young man, have extraordinary potential. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I've done some research on you, Marcus. Your grades are excellent despite the fact that you work part-time jobs to help your mother with expenses. Your teachers describe you as mature, responsible, and kind. You dream of going to college but worry about the cost. Marcus nodded slowly, unsure where this conversation was heading. I want to establish a college scholarship fund for you, Richard said, handing Marcus the envelope. Full tuition, room and board, and living expenses for any four-year university you choose to attend. Marcus stared at the envelope in shock. I don't understand. Why would you do this? Because yesterday a 15-year-old boy taught a 68-year-old businessman what real wealth looks like. True wealth isn't in bank accounts or property portfolios. It's in the ability to help others, to make the world a little bit better than you found it. Richard sat down across from Marcus. Your grandfather died fighting for freedom and justice. Your mother works 3 jobs to provide for you. And you gave away your last $10 to help 2 strangers. That kind of character, that kind of heart, is exactly what this world needs more of. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. Mr. Caldwell, this is too much. I can't accept this. You can and you will, Richard said firmly but kindly. But there are conditions. I want you to promise me that you'll use your education to help others. Whether you become a doctor, teacher, lawyer, or business person, I want you to remember that success means nothing if you don't use it to lift others up. Marcus thought about his grandfather's letter, about his mother's sacrifices, about Harold and Eleanor's story. I promise, he said solemnly. Richard smiled. There's one more thing. I want to offer your mother a job. I need someone to oversee community relations for my properties, someone who understands what it's like to struggle and can help create programs to support tenants facing difficulties. The salary will be enough for her to quit her other jobs and focus on just one meaningful career. Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. She would love that. Mom has always wanted to help people professionally, but she never had the opportunity. The opportunity is here now, Richard said. And Marcus, this is just the beginning. I plan to establish a foundation dedicated to recognizing and rewarding acts of kindness like yours. Young people who demonstrate exceptional character will receive scholarships and mentorship opportunities. Marcus looked down at the envelope in his hands, still struggling to process how dramatically his life had just changed. I have to ask you something, Mr. Caldwell. Why didn't you just mail this or call? Why did you come here personally? Richard thought for a moment. Because 30 years ago I was a lot like you. I grew up poor, worked hard, and had big dreams. But somewhere along the way I lost sight of why I was working so hard. I became focused on accumulating wealth instead of using it wisely. Your simple act of kindness reminded me who I used to be and who I want to be again. He stood up and extended his hand to Marcus. I came here personally because I wanted to thank you. You gave away $10 and changed 4 lives forever. You helped Harold and Eleanor. You gave your mother hope for the future, and you reminded an old businessman what really matters in life. As they shook hands, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just a gift. It was a calling. He thought about all the people he could help with a good education, all the kindness he could pay forward. Mr. Caldwell, Marcus said, I won't let you down. I know you won't, Richard replied. And Marcus, keep giving away those $10. The world needs more people like you. After Richard left, Marcus sat alone in the quiet apartment, holding the envelope that contained his future. He thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. His decision to help 2 strangers, the incredible revelation about his grandfather's sacrifice, and now this life-changing opportunity. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. Working late again tonight. There's leftover soup in the fridge. Love you. Marcus smiled, knowing that by tonight he would have the most amazing news to share with her. He thought about Harold and Eleanor, who would no longer face eviction, and about all the other tenants in Richard's buildings who would benefit from his newfound commitment to compassionate business practices. Sometimes Marcus realized the smallest acts of kindness create ripples that spread far beyond what we can imagine. His $10 gesture had not only changed his own life, but had inspired a wealthy businessman to transform his entire approach to helping others. As he got ready for school, Marcus made a mental note to stop by Tony's diner after classes. He wanted to thank Betty, the waitress, for her kindness that day. And maybe, if he was lucky, he would have the chance to help another stranger in need. After all, he had learned that true wealth wasn't about what you kept for yourself, but about what you gave away to others. And in that regard, a 15-year-old boy from a small apartment had just become one of the richest people in the world.